Short term, the prognosis is a 7 or an 8. Last year was a terrible year, exacerbated by the zero COVID lockdowns. So you end that policy and you automatically have an arithmetic bounce back, which is evident now. The signals are a little bit more mixed than most, including myself, were expecting. But I think definitely an excellent chance that the economy will surpass the official 5% target. It's just a question of how much. But I think the bigger issues are what happens next. And I think after the post zero COVID bounce back, I would give the prognosis a 5. China's facing formidable headwinds of declining working age population and weak productivity, past, present, and future on the productivity front. So, I think it's going to be difficult to maintain the type of rapid growth that China has been accustomed to, and that Xi Jinping feels would be required to validate his promises of adhering to the Chinese dream between now and 2049. I mean, the productivity point's really important, because when your working age population is declining, you need accelerating productivity growth to compensate. And Chinese productivity is measured by total factor productivity, has been declining now for 10 years. So it's going the wrong way. So I think, and a number of your other questions get to the sources of the productivity problem, so I won't go into detail on that right now, but suffice it to say, the medium to longer term outlook is a lot tougher than I've seen it in a long time for China. Certainly, China has done plenty right over the last 45 years and continues to do a lot of things right. Maybe certain things are tougher to execute correctly in light of the circumstances of the declining population. But the two things that worry me the most, Ian, are drawing increasingly greater support from what I still think are ossified, low return, low productivity state-owned enterprises. And if anything, the leadership is doubling down on that. That one shift, really especially since 2013, has accounted for a large portion of the weak productivity and seems likely to continue. And the other thing they're doing wrong, I think, and this worries me potentially even more, is that the regulatory and ideological climate affecting the private sector, China's most dynamic sector, is far more problematic than it's been at any point in the last 25 years. And, the government is trying to convince us that, that's over. But, the inspections and, the continued pressures on executives and on the demand side of the internet platform companies, whether it's live streaming, music, or gaming, continue to impede the demand side of the internet platform companies, and that is something that has yet to be addressed. I participated in the China Development Forum, as I have done for every year since its inception. I think I'm the longest tenured participant in foreign participant in that gathering. I've been to every one except the first one in the year 2000, but every one since then. And in my first presentation at this year's China Development Forum, I raised a similar set of concerns about the potentially lethal combination of declining working age population and faltering productivity. But I did it in the context of, you're not the first one to go through this. This is precisely the same conundrum that Japan faced in the 1990s, which ushered in the first of what is now 3 lost decades. I said, the concern I have is that Japan's working age population peaked 18 years before that of China's in 2016. But the curves are remarkably similar, and the productivity quagmire that Japan has been mired in since its population peak is very comparable to that we now see in China. So the burden of proof is on China to learn the lessons of Japan and make certain they don't get trapped in the same type of stagnation. Needless to say, 1% growth for China replicating the Japanese experience would be an unmitigated disaster, because Japan entered those lost decades when it was wealthy, and China is nowhere near the per capita income of Japan when it first moved into that that period of stagnation. So I warned the China Development Forum of that, and that raised more than a few eyebrows, and urged them, while they cannot really do much to address the demographic problem, certainly over the next 20 years, that the focus on productivity and all the pieces that go into the productivity equation need to be given paramount importance here. One, relying less on state-owned enterprises. And if you're going to stay wedded to the SOEs, be far more aggressive in state-owned enterprise reform than you have. The current formula for reform, these mixed ownership reform models, I don't think is a real plus for Chinese productivity growth, number one. And then secondly, go back to what Jiang Zemin did, especially, but also to some extent, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, unleash the animal spirits of the private sector. You've got to recognize that the private sector is the only alternative to offset the deadweight that SOEs impose on returns and productivity. So the regulatory restraints that were put in place a couple of years ago, again, the need to relax those far more decisively than has been the case thus far becomes crucially important. If you look back over the last, I say 45 years, the pendulum has clearly swung from the blended, increasingly market-based reforms and opening up of the Deng Xiaoping model to a more ideologically pure retrograde to Xi Jinping thought, where ideology permeates literally everything. And that's been a stunning shift. You asked earlier about sort of my rethinking of my optimism. I've been for 25 years that I've been following China closely. I've been a congenital optimist most of the time. And it was the Deng Xiaoping model that really was at the heart of my optimism. And there was a critical point in 2007 when then Premier Wen Jiabao raised an important criticism of the Deng Xiaoping model. He said that while the economy looks strong on the surface, beneath the surface, he was worried because it was unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and ultimately unsustainable. And that sparked a big internal debate. And the leadership embraced what I thought was a powerful rebalancing recipe to shift the growth model away from exports and investment to one driven increasingly by internal private consumption and then embryonic services sector. And drawing on the surplus of household saving to fund a social safety net that would boost consumption all the more. And so I was really encouraged by all that. And that period, 2007 to 2012, really led me to double down on my optimism. Xi Jinping comes into power in late 2012, and I was also encouraged because his first year in office, mainly 2013, he and the team were hard at work on developing a whole new raft of reforms that later became known as the third plenum reforms of, I guess, November 2013. And they did address many of the issues that would be important to turbocharge the rebalancing recipe of Wen Jiabao. But it never happened because the focus immediately turned to anti-corruption, which ultimately gave way to a recipe for power consolidation, and ideology rapidly crept into the equation. Many were dismissive of that at first as just being party rhetoric, and I have to concede I was too. But it took about 4 years, 2017, when the great unveiling of Xi Jinping thought occurred, and at that point, the verdict was sealed. This was going to be a much more ideologically constrained approach to economic development than any of us had thought. And, count me in that group who has been disappointed by this turn of events. But even then, I was still willing to cut the economy and the government slack. But as the demographic clock ticked and the population actually declined last year, the dynamic of productivity came into sharper question for reasons we've already addressed. I started to become more negative. And I guess the final piece in the story came for me at the 20th Party Congress last fall, when Xi Jinping and the leadership really cast aside their high priority on the economy, and the focus was much more on security and addressing conflict with primarily the United States. So, it's been a sort of a gradual but profound transformation for somebody who has been so optimistic on China for most of his career. Let me just go back to the China Development Forum. This is a question that's been addressed in that annual meeting in March every year for easily the past dozen years. And my second presentation at this year's forum was on precisely the question you asked. What would it take to stimulate internal private consumption? And I answered that question. I'll give you my answer in a second. But I prefaced my answer in saying that this was the 8th time in the last 12 years when I have made this presentation on internal private consumption. And every time I make it, I look out, make eye contact with my Chinese friends. There's a general agreement, and it never gets done. I mean, there are 3 building blocks to consumer demand in a developing economy. 1, uncover a new source of job creation. And they've done that by focusing on services. It's a labor-intensive sector in the economy, and the services share of Chinese GDP has risen very sharply over the last 15 years, starting out at 43%. And now it's I think in the mid 50s. Secondly, figure out a way to boost average real wages. And the government has done that by continuing to encourage migration from rural to urban areas, where urban real wages are more than double those of the countryside. So they've done that. And the combination of more job growth and higher real wages gives you a big boost to labor income. But the third piece is where they failed, and that is putting in place incentives that encourage Chinese families, workers, to put that income to work in supporting overall discretionary consumption. And that's where they fail, because the social safety net is still inadequate for a rapidly aging Chinese society. Medical medical care and retirement plans, while their enrollment levels are high, their payouts are low. And so families still fear, as their primary workers get closer and closer to retirement, they still fear an uncertain future, so they save to excess. And it's not that China wants to be a German style economy, or they want to undermine some of the other efforts they've done in industrial policy. To Wen Jiabao's credit, the government has felt for a long time that it needed to rebalance and shift more toward internal private consumption. But it's failed to sort of get to the promised land because of the difficulties it has encountered for a variety of complex reasons in really providing a quantum boost to the social safety net. I wouldn't blame, the planners. I think that the systems are fragmented, they're underfunded, and part of the underfunding reflects the fact that a lot of the available surplus saving that might be allocated to stimulating the healthcare and the pension plans are trapped in this cash cow state-owned enterprise sector, and the vested interests are unwilling to let go of that surplus to provide the support that is required of more secure safety nets. There's also some fragmentation at the local and provincial level that inhibits sort of a nationwide approach to providing more support to the safety net. If they were more creative in attempting to boost the performance of SOEs and really push through an aggressive state-owned enterprise reform strategy, and the same sense, if they took their the pressure off the private sector, especially the internet platform companies, I think they could deliver, once again, a pretty powerful combination of state and private sector impetus. It would still be tempered by the slowing working age population growth, but it would. I think the results would be far more satisfactory than appears to be the case right now. As I look at the broad constellation of problems that China faces, they need a new source of growth. They have to have it. Infrastructure has been a powerful source of growth for a long time, but I think the economy has reached a point of diminishing returns. There's still going to be a fair amount of urbanization to absorb more of the rural workers over the next couple of decades. So there's still some legitimate demand for infrastructure, but far less so than was the case when the growth miracle began in the 1980s. They've just about tapped that one out. I think the the innovation imperative is important, and China has recognized the need to shift to indigenous innovation. This has been a source of conflict with the United States, who claims that China is engaged in nefarious practices when it comes to stealing innovation from the West. I've written a book about this, and I think a lot of those allegations are overblown, but there's some validity as well on that needs to be addressed. But I think the approach that the Biden administration is taking in restricting Chinese access to advanced semiconductor chips is a huge threat to two of their most critical innovations, artificial intelligence and quantum computing, that require ever more rapid processing speeds that can only be delivered by these advanced semiconductor chips. It's forced China to redouble its own efforts to push ahead in domestic advanced technologies, and that's probably good for any economy, China as well as the United States. But there'll be disruptions between now and the time when China, if it ever does, realize those hopes. But clearly, innovation is a very important and a major source of new growth. And then the final one is the one we've already beaten to death, and that is the consumer answer. The consumption share of the Chinese economy today is still less than 40%. That is by far the lowest consumption share of any major economy in the world today. Until China really does the right thing in boosting consumption, then it has to lean more and more on the sources of growth that might otherwise be tapped out, like infrastructure and property and the like, and that has clearly gotten China into a good deal of difficulty in recent years. I've mentioned my favorite one, and that is recognizing and acting on the social safety net imperative. It is the only option that an aging society has to convert a growing reservoir of labor income into discretionary consumption. I've stressing this point really since probably 2008, 2009, immediately after Wen Jiabao raised his critique. I seized on that as a critical missing link in the consumer-led antidote to the unbalanced, unstable economy that Wen Jiabao was so concerned about. And that remains my top area of concern for China, and the most important area that could benefit from aggressive reforms. I did the final meeting of the China Development Forum is always with the premier, so we met with Li Cheng, and he, like other members of the leadership team who spoke, were emphatic in stressing, the message that China is back, the private sector is important. But and quite honestly, I walked away from that thinking that the remarks from all the leaders that we saw and they were all very senior leaders, were almost too scripted. They were trying too hard, and they were constrained by the ideological rhetoric of the pay grade above them. And that was the overarching conclusion that I drew from the tone that I picked up in Beijing. The second conclusion that I walked away from was worrisome for somebody like myself who writes books and articles and gives speeches about the U.S.-China conflict. I think that I picked up a strong sense of resignation on the part of the leadership that this conflict is here to stay. It's not going to change for the foreseeable future, especially given their clear understanding of the political dynamic at work in the United States right now, between now and the 2024 election. The Chinese are absolutely convinced that they have a serious problem, as Xi Jinping said at the National People's Congress, with America's policies of containment, suppression, all around encirclement. And Xi Jinping took it further by saying that that is what's hobbling Chinese development, which I would equate with one of the false narratives that I talk about in my new book. America may have a policy of containment. I think that's probably accurate, but China's development challenges are really of its own making. Blaming America is a false narrative. So I don't think China has quite the America problem that they believe and expressed it when I was there in Beijing in late March. And I would say the same thing for the US. You know, the US, the anti-China sentiment right now is more extreme than it's ever been. And America's convinced that we have a China problem. I put the two of these together and I say, you know, America doesn't have a China problem. China doesn't have an America problem. Together, we have a relationship problem that can only be addressed by mutual policies that would temper the lethal interplay in this increasingly conflicted relationship. And I, you know, that I'm literally talking my own book because that's what I wrote about in the book I published late last year.